Welcome, focused learners, to this explainer on 18th and 19th century British migration. We've got crucial GCSE ground to cover, so let's hit our roadmap.
Right. Here is exactly what we're mastering today. Section 1, the context for migration. Section 2, migrant experience and impact. Section 3, a case study on Liverpool. Section 4, a case study on the East End. And finally, Section 5, comparing the two experiences. Let's get straight to work.
Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, the context for migration. We're going to look specifically at how empire and industry transformed migration into something happening on a completely unprecedented scale.
You see, the period between 1700 and 1900 was totally defined by two massive world-altering forces. First up, the Industrial Revolution. Now, this wasn't just about a few factories popping up. We're talking about a period of incredibly rapid industrial growth that created a massive, insatiable urban demand for labor. It acted like a giant magnet, pulling people into rapidly expanding cities. Second, transatlantic slavery and the broader growth of the British Empire. This brutal economic system fundamentally reshaped Britain's relationship with the wider world, both economically and demographically. And alongside all this, civil liberties were slowly evolving, which gradually changed how migrants could live, work, and organize once they actually arrived. These two massive concepts, they're your absolute foundational building blocks for this topic.
So where were these migrants actually coming from? Well, there are three main origins you need to lock down. First, Ireland. The absolute biggest driver here was the catastrophic Great Famine of the 1840s, though it's super important to remember that Irish migration to Britain happened long before and long after this specific crisis. Second, continental Europe. Crucially, this included Jewish communities who were fleeing intense persecution across Eastern Europe, and specifically the Russian Empire. And third, the British Empire itself. Global migration patterns increasingly connected Britain directly to its colonial possessions all around the world.
Okay, listen closely to this exam tip, because this is exactly how you secure those top marks. Examiners highly reward students who explicitly connect the push and the pull factors. You really need to show you understand that migration doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? For example, the tragedy of the Irish Famine is your classic push factor. It literally forced people to leave. But you absolutely must pair that with a pull factor, like Liverpool's urgent need for dockside labor. Push and pull, always together.
Moving on to Section 2, migrant experience and impact. Let's look at how people actually lived and the new societal forces shaping their daily realities.
So the crucial point here is an entirely new, incredibly powerful force in British society, the media. Before this era, people mostly just relied on local rumor or word of mouth. But now, cheap newspapers meant that for the very first time, mass media was actively shaping public attitudes towards migrants. It wasn't just a mirror reflecting what people already thought. The media was a machine that could deliberately inflame prejudice against newcomers, or, occasionally build genuine sympathy for their plight. And the arrival of these communities permanently transformed four distinct areas of British society. First, culture. Migrants visibly reshaped the character, the sounds, and the very feel of the neighborhoods they settled in. Second, trade and industry. Migrant labor didn't just contribute to city economies, it often became the central driving force of them. Third, politics. These dense communities increasingly became organized political forces in their own right and sadly often political targets as well. Finally, the urban environment. Migrants created distinct, vibrant neighborhoods and built lasting institutions, from places of worship to community halls that are literally still standing today.
I want you to mentally highlight this essential reminder. If your exam asks a question about attitudes in society during this period, the media's role is absolutely your best example, period. Always be ready to explain how newspaper coverage actively shaped, directed, and sometimes manipulated public opinion about these newly arrived migrant communities.
All right, Section 3, our first major case study. Liverpool in the 19th century, the single most important gateway for Irish migration into Britain. And Henry Doyle's 1868 engraving, Emigrants Leave Ireland, brilliantly illustrates the sheer human tragedy and the scale of the arrivals we're discussing. Just look at the reality here. These are families, often starving and desperate, escaping the absolute devastation of the Great Famine. They're boarding ships exactly like the one in the background, crossing the rough Irish Sea and feeding directly into the crowded docks of Liverpool. This is the ultimate heartbreaking push factor made totally visible.
But why Liverpool specifically? Well, first, it's just simple geography. If you look at a map, it was the natural nearest first stop across the Irish Sea. Second, Liverpool already had incredibly strong pre-existing trade and travel links with Ireland, making the journey logistically a lot easier. And third, it was a massive global port. For many migrants, Liverpool was a gateway. Some definitely intended to settle there and find work, while countless others saw it merely as a transit point to board larger ships bound for North America.
Now, the reality of life for Irish migrants in Liverpool was incredibly tough. They faced severe poverty, horrifying overcrowding in slum housing, and intense social hostility from the existing population. But it's not just a story of suffering. It's a story of incredible resilience. They built lasting community institutions to support one another. And this community was strongly, undeniably centered around the Catholic Church, which provided a vital anchor in a really hostile environment. Ultimately, this massive influx permanently reshaped Liverpool's population, its culture, and its politics forever. Here's another crucial tip for your exam. When you write about Liverpool, do not just focus on the human tragedy, as important as that is. Liverpool is a story about scale and infrastructure. To really secure those higher marks, you must mention Liverpool's physical role as a major port and transit hub, right alongside the human story of the migrants themselves.
Shifting gears now to Section 4, Case Study on the East End. We're looking at a very different migration story, arriving in the same broad period.
To really understand this case study, we have to firmly establish the 1880s context. The primary push factor here was entirely different from the Irish Famine. Jewish communities migrated in large numbers to Britain specifically to escape terrifying and intensifying religious and political persecution, particularly within the Russian Empire and across Eastern Europe. They were literally fleeing for their lives and their freedom.
Now, what's really interesting about this specific settlement is the geography and economy. They settled heavily in the East End of London, specifically centering around the districts of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. And once there, they didn't just blend into existing heavy industry. They built incredibly distinct trades. We're talking tailoring, skilled furniture making, and vibrant street trading. Economic hubs, most famously the bustling Petticoat Lane Market, became absolutely iconic parts of late Victorian and Edwardian life. However, much like the Irish in Liverpool, despite their immense economic contribution, they faced harsh social hostility, including rising highly visible anti-Semitism as the century turned.
Which brings us to Section 5, comparing the two experiences. Let's synthesize both case studies to develop those high-level analytical skills. The GCSE specification loves a paired comparison, and these two case studies are designed perfectly for it. Just look at the contrasts and the similarities here. The Irish in Liverpool fled a natural and political disaster, famine, and settled in a major port gateway anchoring their new lives around the Catholic Church. On the other hand, the Jewish community in London fled targeted persecution, concentrated tightly in specific East End trades, and brought entirely different geographic origins and religious practices. Yet, crucially, both groups experienced that same intense duality. They faced deep social hostility while simultaneously making undeniably massive economic and cultural contributions to their new cities. Let's move to our next point and see how this builds into your exam technique. My absolute biggest piece of advice for this topic: always use a threaded comparison. Do not write one big paragraph about Liverpool and then a completely separate paragraph about the East End. That is just writing two mini essays, and honestly, examiners hate it. Instead, compare theme by theme. Write a paragraph on their reasons for migration and contrast the famine with the persecution. Write a paragraph on their economic roles and contrast the dockwork with the tailoring trades. Structuring your analysis thread by thread always scores significantly higher.
So, what does this all mean for you? Well, I want to leave you with a challenge. Here is a perfect exam-style question directly from the source material. In what ways were the experiences of Irish migrants in Liverpool and Jewish migrants in London similar, and in what ways did they differ? Don't just close this explainer and move on. I highly recommend you pause right now, grab a pen, and actively outline your answer using that threaded comparison technique we just mastered. Are you ready to put this into practice? By doing that, you'll totally cement this knowledge and be absolutely ready for exam day. Keep analyzing, keep comparing, and I'll see you in the next explainer.